Hello, all. I wanted to talk about another movie that I had heard of, a 1950s science fiction movie that I'd heard of but never seen until a couple of nights ago. It's called 4D Man, and it stars the acting premiere of both Robert Lansing and the beautiful Lee Merriweather, and also stars James Cogden and Edgar Stehli and a guy Raymond, Jasoer Deeter, a very beautiful girl called Chic James, and it's a really interesting story. It was directed by a guy named Robert Yeworth Jr. Robert Yeworth Jr. Also directed The Blob, and he apparently used the money for this that he got from The Blob to make this movie. It was written by let's see who it was written by. Jack Harris. And Jack Harris wrote the original screenplay for this. Jack Harris was the producer of the movie. It's very, very interesting. It's about a scientist. There are basically two main plots. The scientist played by Robert Lansing is named Scott Nelson, and he is working to create an impenetrable metal for his boss, whose name is T.W. Carson, which is called Cargonite, after Carson. And he has a series of failures, and the other plot is about his somewhat shiftless brother, Tony Nelson, who's also a scientist, who is trying to create a way to create a fourth state, a 4D state, four-dimensional state of matter, where any form of matter can pass through another form by using what he refers to as a force field. And the first thing we see is he has constructed a laboratory somewhere in England, and while he is trying to create this force field, something goes wrong, and the entire laboratory catches fire and burns down. And he's quite obviously fired, and now he's out of work, and he's upset, and he has to basically go to his brother in the United States to beg for a job. And he goes to the lab where he has finally succeeded in creating this impenetrable, quote unquote impenetrable metal called Cargonite, which Carson takes the credit for, because that's the kind of person he is. He's kind of an egomaniac, which is why he named the metal after himself. And so now he doesn't really have another project, and he's sort of at a loose end. He's going to ask his girlfriend, who's also his lab assistant, played by Lee Merriweather, to marry him. He's fallen in love with her, and then Tony comes into the picture, and a triangle begins, because Lee Merriweather is very attracted to his brother, because he's very handsome, and he's, I think, closer to her own age. And they start a little bit of a clandestine affair. He's telling his brother, I'm not going to give you any money, you never do anything with it, and, you're kind of a ne'er-do-well. And he says, well, you can give me a job. He says, doing what? You're not qualified to do anything here at the lab. And he starts telling him about this experiment of his. He says, that's all you do is experiment. You don't have anything you can't show me anything that you've actually done. He says, oh yeah, just look. And he says, you remember that experiment you taught me a long time ago about there was a company in France that put together a piece of gold and a piece of lead, and they eventually merged into each other. He said, yeah, that took decades for that to happen. He said, what if I could make it happen quickly? What if it could happen in 5 minutes? He says, oh, come on. And he says, you just wait here. He goes upstairs. He comes back with a solid piece of metal, and a ordinary lead pencil has penetrated all the way through the metal. He said, but this didn't happen by heating the metal. It didn't happen by merging them, and it wasn't created by the force field. I willed it. He said, what do you mean you willed it? He said, I thought about it. I had the force field turned on, and I just thought about it, the pencil penetrating the lead, and it happened. And he said, I made it happen. I willed it to happen. He says, oh, come on, now you're claiming you're a psychic, give me a break. He says, well, if you give me some money for my own lab, I could prove it, and I can go through anything, even this impenetrable Cargonite. Using this force field, I can penetrate it. And if you had that, weapon, how much would that be worth? And he says, reluctantly, Lansing says, okay, I'll give you the money, I'll get you set up with your own lab, but you got to prove results. I don't want to, be throwing good money after bad, and have this all turn out to be nonsense, or a trick of some kind. And he gives him the lab, and since he's not doing anything officially now for Carson, Steve starts kind of talking as if this project is his idea, and he wants to get the approval of Carson to do this. So now he's going to be over Tony. He's going to be Tony's boss in this project, which Tony doesn't like, because he wants to pursue the 4D state by himself, and he does he sort of goes through the back door, gets money from Carson directly, and he presents the papers to Carson's sort of toady, which is a guy named Dr. Wells, who was played by Jasoer Deeter, and he's a kind of unscrupulous person who takes credit for other people's work too. And he doesn't tell him that Carson gave me this. Tony Nelson. He says, it's my idea. So now Carson gives the money to Tony to develop his force field, and he locks it up in his locker so that Steve can't take credit for it, basically. Meanwhile, he's starting to fall in love with Lee Merriweather, and Lee Merriweather is starting to fall in love with him. There's a scene where they're kissing, and it's raining, and they have a very romantic scene. And he says, "I can't do this. You're my brother's girl." And she says, "No, I'm your girl. I'm not your brother's girl." So she doesn't want Robert Lansing. She wants James Cogden, and this causes him to become upset. He wants to leave. He feels like he's interfering in his brother's life. He's going to ruin everything for him. But meanwhile, Steve sees them kissing and gets very upset. He goes to Tony's lab and breaks into his footlocker, which is locked by a padlock. He smashes the padlock off and finds the force field inside. Takes a small piece of this cargonite, this impenetrable metal, turns on the force field, concentrates, and manages to push his hand through the cargonite. And then something goes wrong. He can't get his hand back out, and he's freaking out. It's obviously causing him a great deal of pain. And somehow, just by further concentration, he pulls his hand back out. Before this, I should mention, before this, he had started to faint when he went down a flight of stairs to look at the cargonite that he was trying to create through a secure lead-shielded door, because it's radioactive material. And he thinks that maybe, he's been affected by radioactivity. He goes to his doctor, who is telling him, no, you're fine. There's nothing wrong with you. You don't have any radiation poisoning. There's nothing, but there's something unusual in your brain pattern. He says, what do you mean there's something unusual? I said, well, there's a reason I ran the EEG twice. An electroencephalogram is only supposed to record the activity of the brain. So, but yours recorded something different. Yours seems to be, you have activity that doesn't appear to be normal. You seem to have some sort of extra, ability in your brain. And he says, oh, don't be ridiculous. I don't have any extra, I can't do anything. And now that he's done this experiment with the force field and put his hand through the cargonite, he starts to experience some weird things. He finds that he goes to open the door, and his hand actually goes through the door. Physically, it actually goes into the door, and he pulls it out the other side. It's like, what the hell? He can't figure out what's going on. And he starts reluctantly at first experimenting with this. He finds that he can take a letter outside of a locked mailbox, and he pulls it out. He pushes his hand physically into the mailbox, pulls it out, looks at it to make sure it's real, then he puts it back into the slot of the mailbox. He goes to a jewelry store. He puts his hand through the window of the jewelry store, starts to take out a necklace, but his moral sense gets the better of him. He puts it back. Well, apparently that moral sense doesn't last too long, because the next thing he does is he goes to a bank, and apparently he pulls out a locked safe deposit box, like right through the wall of the bank, because he has this ability now. Well, he suddenly starts having some very bad, side effects of this ability, which doesn't seem to last too long. It lasts about, an hour or so. and all of a sudden his hair's starting to turn white, and his face is like terribly aged. He talks to his brother about this theory, about this 4D theory. He says, well, you remember you were talking about, what if you could, fuse metal in just a minute instead of, 4 years or 4 decades? He says, what would happen to a person if they had that kind of ability? He says, well, if you compressed all that energy that it would take to do that into, a minute or a couple minutes, it would take an enormous amount of energy out of the person doing it, and they would probably have some very bad side effects. They would start to age really rapidly. They'd age like 10 years for every minute that they did this, and he realizes to his horror that this is what's happening to him. In an effort to stop it, he goes to his doctor again and says, "Doctor, you got to help me." He says, "What do you mean?" He says, "I'll show you." And his hands go right through the door of the doctor's office. He's like stunned. He doesn't understand what's going on, and he accidentally touches the doctor. He pats him on the shoulder, and his hands penetrate right into the doctor's body, and the doctor screams and falls back, and all of a sudden he ages very rapidly into an old man. But Robert Lansing regains his youth. The effect that he had incurred by using this 4D ability is now reversed, but he's had to kill somebody to do it. And meanwhile, he goes back to the lab, and he's talking to some of the people, and he puts the force field into the nuclear generator room so that nobody can find it, hides it essentially. And Tony's looking for it. He can't find it, and he says, I don't know what's happened to my experiment. And he eventually confesses to Tony that he has this ability. He shows it to him by, again, putting his hand through something. And he says, but it seems to be taking a terrible toll on me. I'm getting older. He notices it. He notices that he's aging. Then he says, you have to help me find a way to stop it. And Tony says, I don't know if I can stop it. And he's trying to work on a way to do it. He says, okay, I'll build another force field, but you got to promise not to interfere with it this time, and let me do it. And he says, okay, if you can stop this thing, please, go ahead and build the force field. I'll give you the money you need, and build it and help me, because I don't want to be like this. And meanwhile, you find out about the bank robbery. It's in the newspaper. They can't figure out what happened. But a police officer later says, can you explain to me, when he's interviewing Tony, says, can you explain to me how a $1,000 bill was jammed into a solid template of metal and it actually passed through it? And then he starts tweeting, oh my God, he's got this, my brother has this ability, and he's using it for bad things. And they also find out about the doctor's death, and they can't explain it. And now somebody else has died, and they can't explain that either. And they realize that eventually Lee Merriweather and James Cogden figure out that what he's doing, what Steve is doing, is to retain his youth. He is using this 4D ability to kill people, and they drain them of their energy, and it feeds it to him, sort of a vampiric way. And they're horrified. They have to stop him now. They have to find a way to reverse this thing, and they're trying to create a new force field that will be so powerful that it'll turn this ability off. Eventually, the cops find out about it too, and there's a kind of a funny scene where, well, it's not funny, it's kind of scary actually, where Robert Lansing picks up a girl in a bar who's very attractive, and that's the girl played by Chic James, who's kind of a platinum blonde, bombshell, and he takes her out to the car, and he's talking with her, and he kisses her, and then she turns into an old woman and dies, and he again reverses in age. Now the cops are onto it. They figured out that he's killing people, and they have to corner him, but they can't do anything. They can't, because he can walk through walls and walk right through buildings. Every time they corner him, he just walks into another building, and they figure eventually that he'll come to the lab and seeking help, and he does. And Tony finally tells me, I don't know if I can help you. And he says he turns the force field on and tries it, and it doesn't really seem to do it. For a moment, it does seem to work, and Lee Merriweather shoots him, and you think he's going to die, and for some reason he could somehow heal from this, and I don't know how, because he doesn't actually touch anybody. He doesn't seem to heal. The last thing you see is he walks through a solid wall of this quote-unquote Karganite, and the end credits say "the end" with a question mark. So was he destroyed or was he not destroyed? We don't really know. I thought it was really well directed. It was very well written, I thought. The script is really interesting. It's, again, very creepy and strange and weird. It's kind of part science fiction, part horror. And for 1959, and this is in Technicolor, it is a Technicolor film, I thought it was really good. Interesting that for some reason, and you can kind of tell, Lee Merriweather dyed her red hair black in this movie, and you can kind of see the red roots beneath it, and the giveaway is her green eyes and her pale, beautiful skin. But she looked really gorgeous in this, and would go on to do many other things, including be Catwoman in the Batman movie, and her continuing role on the Time Tunnel, which she was basically the only thing I liked about the Time Tunnel. Interesting movie, 4D Man, really weird, creepy, very well done. Great jazz soundtrack too. Its soundtrack is more like a film noir soundtrack, very jazzy and upbeat.